The house sat at the edge of a forgotten town, surrounded by a dense forest whose bare trees seemed to claw at the sky. It had been abandoned for decades, or so people believed. To the townsfolk, it was the Widow's Shadow, named after the last known inhabitant, a woman who had allegedly lost her family to a fire that never reached her home. Rumors of strange sights in the upper window and muffled cries at night had solidified its place as a source of local dread. But that didn't stop Clara. At 23, Clara was known for her rebellious streak. She was an artist and, by her own admission, addicted to the rush of exploring what others dared not approach. When her boyfriend, Marco, joked about staying overnight in the house for a viral challenge, Clara's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what I need for my next piece," she had said, her tone full of exhilaration. Marco hesitated, but her determination was infectious. The two stood before the house now, shrouded in a mist that thickened as the sun set. Clara's boots crunched over brittle leaves as she adjusted the bag slung over her shoulder, full of cameras, sketchbooks, and flashlights. "This is insane," Marco muttered, staring up at the second-floor window where local legend claimed the widow's face sometimes appeared. It was empty now, but the dark glass seemed to watch them. "Scared already?" Clara teased, stepping closer to the sagging porch. Marco shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, glancing over his shoulder at the fading light. "It's not fear, Clara. It's respect for not getting murdered in some cliché horror setup." She laughed, her voice cutting through the cold silence. "Relax. If there's a ghost, I'll ask it to pose for my sketches." The inside of the house was worse than expected. Peeling wallpaper hung like limp flags, and the floor creaked ominously beneath their weight. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. Marco set up the lantern while Clara roamed the living room, her fingers brushing the cold mantelpiece. Her eyes fell on an old mirror, its surface speckled with age. She pulled out her sketch pad and began to outline its warped frame. "You should see this mirror, Marco," she called. "It's like it's holding on to memories." He grunted from the doorway of what used to be the kitchen. "Yeah, great, you sketch, I'll make sure no one." The sound came first, a low moan that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards. Marco froze. "Did you hear that?" Clara didn't respond. She was staring into the mirror, her sketch forgotten. In its distorted surface, the room behind her reflected something, or someone, that wasn't there. "Marco." Her voice trembled for the first time. "What?" He hurried to her side. She pointed at the mirror. Look there." Marco stared, his breath fogging the glass. The mirror showed a woman's silhouette in the second-floor window. But when they both turned to look directly, the window was empty. "Let's go," Marco whispered, gripping Clara's arm. "No," she said, pulling away. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a mix of terror and excitement. "We're staying. This is what I wanted." "That's insane." The upstairs floorboards groaned above them, as though someone or something was walking slowly toward the staircase. Marco cursed under his breath. Clara reached for her phone, aiming it toward the staircase and pressing record. "Come on," she said, dragging him forward. The first step creaked loudly, and Marco flinched. "You're gonna get us killed," he muttered, but followed her anyway. When they reached the landing, the air turned frigid. Clara's breath clouded in front of her as she peered down the hallway, lit only by their flashlights. At the end of the corridor was the door to the infamous room, the one everyone in town said was cursed. The door was ajar. "Don't," Marco whispered. Clara ignored him, stepping closer. As she reached the doorway, her flashlight flickered and died. She switched to her phone's light and pushed the door open. Inside was an empty room, bare except for a wooden chair in the center. And the widow. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face painted with an eerie black cross that stretched from her forehead to her chin. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her sunken eyes. Clara's phone clattered to the floor. Marco's scream pierced the night, but by the time the townsfolk found their way to the house the next day, there was no trace of them, except Clara's phone, lying beneath the wooden chair, still recording. The police arrived the next morning, summoned by a terrified jogger who claimed to have heard screams echoing from the widow's house. It wasn't the first time someone had reported strange sounds from the place, but this time was different. The jogger swore he saw a phone light flashing inside the house, just before the screaming stopped. Detective Emma Reyes stood outside the creaking structure, her leather boots firmly planted on the rotting steps of the porch. She wasn't one for ghost stories, but the legend of the widow's shadow was one she couldn't ignore. Missing persons were her job, not the supernatural nonsense locals whispered about. Still, as she stepped inside, the icy air seemed to carry a weight that set her on edge. The interior was eerily silent, except for the occasional drip of water from a cracked pipe. Her flashlight scanned the empty living room, revealing dust-coated furniture and the mirror Clara had sketched the night before. It was cracked now, as if something or someone had punched it from the inside. "Detective, over here," called Officer Martinez from upstairs. Emma took the steps two at a time, her hand on the holster of her pistol. When she entered the room at the end of the hall, Martinez was standing near the chair, his face pale. "Found this under the chair." He held up Clara's phone, its cracked screen still recording. Emma's stomach twisted. She took the phone from him and pressed play. The footage was shaky, but clear. It started with Clara's excited whisper. "This is it, Marco. This is the widow's room." The camera panned over the wooden chair, the empty walls, and the shadows stretching across the floor. Then came the gasp, followed by Clara's voice trembling. "Do you see her? In the corner? Marco, do you?" The screen blurred as Clara dropped the phone. The last visible image was a woman's figure in the chair, her painted cross face staring directly at the camera. Then came Marco's scream, followed by static. Emma shut the phone off and exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the footage or the realization that the room didn't have any corners. Its walls were completely bare. "Check the perimeter," she ordered Martinez, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "I want a full sweep of this place." The team searched every inch of the house and the overgrown yard but found no sign of Clara or Marco. By noon, Emma was back at her office, staring at the evidence laid out on her desk. Clara's phone, Marco's wallet found near the staircase, and a series of black and white photos taken from the house. One photo caught her attention. It was an old portrait hung in the hallway upstairs, one she hadn't noticed during the search. It showed a woman with a striking resemblance to the figure in the recording. Her face was stern, her dark eyes piercing, and a black cross was painted over her skin. Beneath the photo, in faded script, was a name, Amara da Silva. Emma typed the name into her database, expecting nothing, but to her surprise, a match appeared. Amara da Silva had died in 1962. Cause of death? Suicide. "Detective Reyes," Martinez interrupted, holding a thin folder. "Background on the da Silva property." Emma took the file and skimmed it. Amara had lived alone after the death of her family in a fire. Locals claim she went mad with grief, thus performing strange rituals in the house before taking her life in the very room where Clara and Marco had disappeared. But the file included a detail that made Emma's blood run cold. It wasn't a suicide. The autopsy revealed that Amara had been found tied to a chair, her face painted with a black cross, her lips sewn shut. Emma's phone buzzed, pulling her out of the chilling revelation. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Detective Reyes," she said. The line crackled with static, followed by a faint voice she barely recognized. "Help. Us." Emma gripped the phone tighter. "Clara? Is that you?" The static grew louder, and the voice whispered again, "She won't let us leave." The call disconnected. Emma sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. She replayed the voice in her mind, trying to convince herself it was a prank. But deep down, she knew the truth. Clara and Marco were still in that house, somewhere beyond the physical walls. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Martinez caught up with her in the hallway. "You're not going back there, are you?" Emma didn't stop. "I am. And this time, I'm finding them." By the time Detective Emma Reyes arrived back at the widow's house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the decaying structure in shadow. This time, she was alone. She hadn't told Martinez or the others. She couldn't risk being stopped. Every instinct she had as a detective screamed at her to follow protocol, but the voice on the phone haunted her. It had been Clara, and she wasn't about to waste time waiting for backup. The air was colder than before, biting through her jacket as she stepped onto the porch. The house loomed above her, its broken windows like empty eye sockets watching her approach. She drew her flashlight and pistol, the beam of light slicing through the darkness as she pushed the door open. Inside, the house was unnervingly silent. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and her breath came in visible clouds. The living room mirror was shattered now, its shards glittering across the floor. She glanced at the fragments, catching her reflection in one, only to see a shadowy figure standing behind her. Emma spun around, her pistol raised. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm. Nothing answered, but the creak of the house settling. She turned back to the mirror, her pulse pounding. The figure was gone, leaving only her wide-eyed reflection. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, stepping over the glass. She climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath her boots. The hallway stretched before her, the door to the cursed room still ajar. Emma hesitated at the threshold, her flashlight illuminating the chair in the center of the room. It was empty now, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. She stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the walls. There were scratches etched into the plaster, jagged lines that looked like they'd been made by desperate fingers. Emma's throat tightened as she imagined Clara or Marco clawing at the walls, trying to escape. Then the door slammed shut behind her. Emma whirled around, her flashlight flickering. She grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Her pulse quickened as the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every passing second. She turned back toward the chair and froze. The widow was there. Amara da Silva sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Her black cross-painted face tilted slightly as if studying Emma. Her lips didn't move, but a voice echoed in the room, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come back." Emma tightened her grip on her pistol, her voice steady despite the icy dread crawling up her spine. "Where are they? What have you done with Clara and Marco?" The widow's head tilted further, her eyes dark and unblinking. "They belong to me now, just as you will." The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging the room into darkness. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she fumbled to turn it back on. When the light flickered back to life, the chair was empty. A whisper brushed against her ear. "Run." Emma turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls shifting and warping as if the house itself were alive. The scratches on the walls deepened, splitting open to reveal rotting wood beneath. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching toward her like grasping hands. She fired a shot into the darkness, the deafening sound briefly breaking the oppressive silence. The recoil steadied her trembling hands, but the bullet hit nothing. The shadows continued their advance, whispering unintelligible words that made her head spin. "Enough," Emma shouted, her voice echoing in the small room. "You don't scare me." The whispers stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then came the sound of a child laughing, a high, chilling giggle that made her blood run cold. She turned toward the sound and saw it, a small figure standing in the doorway. It was a girl, no older than 10, her dress tattered and stained. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "Who?" Emma began, but the girl raised a finger to her lips, silencing her. Then she pointed to the far wall, where the shadows were darkest. Emma hesitated but stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The wall seemed solid at first, but as she reached out, her fingers sank into it. The surface rippled like water, and a faint glow began to emanate from within. She could hear voices now. Clara's and Marco's, faint and desperate. "Detective," Clara's voice cried out. "Please help us." Emma didn't think. She plunged her arm into the wall, the cold searing her skin. Her fingers brushed against something solid, a hand. She gripped it tightly and pulled, the wall resisting as if it were alive. With a final yank, Clara tumbled out, gasping for air. Emma steadied her, relief flooding through her. "Clara, where's Marco?" Clara's eyes widened in terror. "He's still inside. We have to get him out." Before Emma could react, the room erupted in chaos. The walls groaned, and the shadows surged toward them, screaming with inhuman rage. The widow's voice rang out, her tone furious. "You cannot take what is mine." Emma grabbed Clara's hand. "Run!" she shouted, pulling her toward the door. But as they reached it, the shadows blocked their path, forming a solid barrier. The widow appeared again, her form towering and monstrous now, her painted face contorted with fury. "You'll have to fight for him," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Emma tightened her grip on her pistol, her eyes locked on the widow. Then let's finish this. The room trembled as the widow's enraged form grew larger, her shadow casting grotesque shapes across the walls. Clara clung to Emma, her breath shallow and panicked. The detective tightened her grip on the pistol, her mind racing for a plan. "Stay behind me," Emma ordered, her voice firm despite the chaos swirling around them. The widow let out a piercing scream, the sound reverberating through the room and forcing Emma to her knees. Clara covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. The shadows writhed violently, lashing out like whips that struck the walls and floor, leaving scorch marks in their wake. "You can't win." The widow's voice boomed, disembodied and echoing. "This house is mine. They are mine." Emma gritted her teeth and pushed herself upright. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she muttered. She aimed her pistol and fired at the widow's towering form. The bullet passed through her harmlessly, shattering a chunk of the far wall. But for a moment, the widow flickered, her form destabilizing like static on a broken TV. "Emma?" Clara gasped, pointing at the chair in the center of the room. It had changed. Where before it was an old wooden relic, it was now covered in deep, bloody grooves, its arms bound with frayed ropes. And in the seat, barely visible, was Marco. He was slumped forward, his head hanging low, his body eerily still. "Marco!" Clara screamed, trying to run toward him, but Emma held her back. "Wait," Emma said, her eyes darting between Marco and the widow, who was watching them with a sickening grin. "It's a trap." "Smart," the widow purred, her voice dripping with malice. But not smart enough. The shadows surged forward, faster than before. Emma grabbed Clara and dove to the floor, narrowly avoiding a tendril of darkness that sliced through the air where they had been standing. The two scrambled behind the chair, using it as a shield as the shadows struck again and again, each impact sending splinters flying. "Marco, wake up," Clara sobbed, shaking his shoulder. His head lolled to the side, and for a moment, Emma feared the worst. But then he groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Clara?" he rasped, his voice weak. "It's me. We're getting you out of here." She cried, fumbling with the ropes binding his wrists. Emma peeked over the edge of the chair, her pistol raised. The widow was advancing, her form twisting unnaturally, her limbs elongating as she approached. Emma fired again, aiming for the dark mass of shadows swirling around her. This time, the bullet struck something solid, and the widow let out a guttural shriek. The shadows recoiled, giving them a brief moment of respite. "Hurry," Emma urged Clara, who was still struggling with the ropes. "They're too tight," Clara cried, her fingers trembling. Emma grabbed her pocket knife and slashed at the ropes. They gave way, and Marco collapsed into Clara's arms, too weak to stand. She helped him to his feet, his weight almost too much for her to bear. The widow's scream rose again, shaking the walls and sending a cascade of dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick and suffocating. "There's no escape," the widow snarled. "You think you've saved him, but you've only doomed yourselves." Emma ignored her, dragging Clara and Marco toward the door. The shadows lunged at them, but Emma fired again, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in brief bursts. The shadows recoiled with each shot, but they kept coming, relentless and hungry. They reached the door and Emma threw her shoulder against it. It didn't budge. "No, no, no," she muttered, ramming it again. The door felt like it was made of stone, unyielding and immovable. She turned to Clara, who was holding Marco upright. "There has to be another way out." "The window," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Emma turned her flashlight toward the far wall. The glass of the window was cracked and grimy, but it was large enough to climb through. She motioned for Clara to follow as she moved toward it, clearing debris from their path. But as they neared the window, the widow appeared before them, her form blocking their only exit. Her face was a mask of fury, the black cross painted on her skin glowing faintly. "You can't leave," she hissed. "This is your grave." Emma didn't hesitate. She emptied the remaining bullets in her pistol, each shot striking the widow and causing her to flicker like a dying flame. The last shot hit her square in the chest, and she let out a blood-curdling scream that shook the entire house. The widow's form began to dissolve, her edges blurring as if she were being erased. But even as she faded, her voice remained echoing in the room. This house will never let you go." The walls groaned, and the floor beneath them began to buckle. Emma grabbed Clara and Marco, pulling them toward the window. She smashed the glass with the butt of her pistol, clearing the shards before helping Clara climb through. "Hurry!" Emma shouted as the floorboards splintered and gave way, revealing a dark, bottomless void beneath. Clara managed to pull Marco through the window, his legs dragging as he barely managed to hold on. Emma climbed after them, the void below reaching hungrily for her heels. Just as the last of the floor collapsed, she threw herself out of the window, landing hard on the overgrown grass outside. The three of them lay there, gasping for air as the house shuddered and groaned. The windows shattered one by one, and the roof caved in with a deafening crash. Finally, the house fell silent, its once imposing frame reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. Emma sat up, her body aching, and looked at Clara and Marco. They were alive, but shaken, their faces pale with fear. "It's over," Emma said, her voice hoarse. But as she turned to look at the remains of the house, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Amidst the rubble stood the chair, untouched and perfectly intact. And in the faint moonlight, she could swear she saw a figure sitting there, watching them. The sirens pierced the cold night air as emergency responders arrived at the scene. Firefighters, paramedics, and police swarmed the area, their flashlights cutting through the thick mist that seemed to cling to the ruins of the widow's house. Emma stood by the paramedics as they tended to Marco, wrapping him in a blanket and checking his vitals. Clara sat beside him, gripping his hand tightly, her eyes distant and unfocused. Emma couldn't take her eyes off the chair. It sat untouched in the center of the wreckage, defying the destruction around it. The air seemed heavier near it, and Emma swore the shadows pooled unnaturally beneath it. She wanted to believe her ordeal was over, that they had escaped the widow's grasp. But the sight of that chair made her stomach churn. "Detective?" Martinez's voice pulled her back. He approached with his usual clipboard in hand, but his expression was uneasy. "What the hell happened here? The neighbors said they heard explosions, screaming, and now the house is gone." Emma hesitated, unsure how to explain. "It collapsed," she said, avoiding his gaze. "The structure was too unstable." Martinez frowned, glancing at the rubble. "And what about the missing kids? Did you find them?" "They're safe," Emma said, nodding toward Clara and Marco. "But something isn't right here." "Yeah, no kidding," Martinez muttered, scribbling notes. "But you look like you've seen a ghost. You sure you're okay?" Emma didn't answer. She wasn't okay, not even close. Instead, she turned back to Clara and Marco. They were safe, but they were far from okay. Marco's hands trembled uncontrollably, and his eyes darted to the ruins as if expecting the shadows to rise up again. Clara sat in silence, her knuckles white as she clutched Marco's arm. "Clara," Emma said softly, crouching in front of her. "I need you to tell me what happened in there. Everything." Clara blinked as if waking from a nightmare. Her lips trembled and she glanced at Marco before speaking. "It was her. The widow," she whispered. She doesn't just haunt the house. She is the house. She controls it." Marco shuddered at her words. "She wanted us to stay, to be part of her collection." Emma's brow furrowed. "Collection?" Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "There were others. We saw them, faces in the walls and the floor, trapped. They were crying for help, but she wouldn't let them go." Emma's stomach twisted. "How did you escape?" Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting to the chair. "We didn't. You pulled me out, but Marco, I don't know how he's here. He was still tied to that chair when everything fell apart." Marco swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "She let me go." Emma leaned closer. "Why?" I don't know," Marco said, his eyes wide with fear. "But when I looked at her, she said, 'Tell them.'" "Tell them what?" Emma asked, her voice urgent. Marco shook his head. "I don't know. But I think she meant, she's not done." Before Emma could respond, one of the paramedics called out, "Detective, you should take a look at this." She rose and followed him to the edge of the wreckage. The paramedic pointed to a spot where the rubble had shifted, revealing a charred wooden plank. Scrawled across it in deep, jagged letters were the words, "She never leaves." Emma's blood ran cold. That night, Emma sat in her apartment, unable to sleep. She had showered, but she still felt the grime of the house clinging to her skin. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the widow's face, her dark eyes boring into her soul. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Martinez. "Reyes," she answered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "You need to see this," Martinez said. There was an edge to his voice that made her sit up straighter. A neighbor sent in a tip about the widow's house, a video. Emma's heart pounded. "What kind of video?" "I'm emailing it to you now. Just watch it." Emma opened her laptop and clicked on the link Martinez sent. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, but it clearly showed the house. The timestamp indicated it was recorded just an hour ago. At first, the video showed nothing unusual, just the ruins of the house bathed in moonlight. But then, movement. A figure stepped into frame, walking among the rubble. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but her posture and movements were unmistakable. She stopped by the chair and sat down. The camera zoomed in, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. The figure raised her head, revealing the black cross painted on her face. She stared directly into the camera, her lips curling into a smile. The video ended abruptly. Emma slammed the laptop shut, her hands trembling. She stared at her reflection in the dark screen, her mind racing. The widow was still there. Still watching, still waiting. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "You can't save them all." Emma's breath hitched. Her apartment felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker. She checked the locks on her door, her heart pounding, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. The widow never left. The next morning, Emma sat in her car parked outside Clara's apartment. The events of the previous night played on an endless loop in her mind. The video, the text message, and the chilling realization that the widow wasn't bound to the ruins of her house. She could still feel the icy dread creeping along her skin, as if the widow's shadow had followed her home. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself before stepping out of the car. Clara had been staying with a friend since being released from the hospital, but Emma knew she needed answers, and Clara might be the only one who could provide them. Clara opened the door after a few knocks, her face pale and drawn. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at sleepless nights. "Detective," she said weakly. "What's wrong?" "Can I come in?" Emma asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Inside, the apartment was cluttered but warm. Marco was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at a muted TV. He didn't acknowledge Emma as she walked past. "I need to ask you something," Emma said, turning to Clara. "About the widow." Clara flinched at the name, her arms crossing over her chest. "Why can't you just leave it alone?" she whispered. "We got out, isn't that enough?" "She's not done," Emma said firmly. "I've seen her, and I think you have too." Clara's eyes widened. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "That's not possible. We left her in that house." "She's not in the house anymore," Emma replied, pulling out her phone and showing Clara the video Martinez had sent. Clara's hands trembled as she watched the footage, her face growing paler with each passing second. "It can't be," Clara whispered. "We destroyed her." "No," Emma said. "We didn't, and now she's coming for us." That night, Emma sat in her apartment once again, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent the day digging through every file she could find on Amara da Silva, searching for any clue about how to stop her. But most of the records were vague, full of rumors and speculation. Some claimed she had been a witch, others that she was a victim of possession. None of it felt solid enough to act on. A knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Too late for visitors. She approached the door cautiously, her hand resting on her holstered pistol. "Who is it?" she called. No answer. She peered through the peephole but saw only darkness. Her heart raced as she slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty. A chill ran down her spine as she closed the door and locked it again. Turning back toward the living room, she froze. The air in the apartment had shifted, growing colder. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were pressing in on her. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a text from an unknown number. "You can't run." Emma's breath hitched. She backed away from the phone, her hand instinctively going to her pistol. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like a rocking chair moving in an empty room. It was coming from her bedroom. She swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. Drawing her gun, she crept toward the door. The creaking grew louder with each step, and her grip on the weapon tightened. She pushed the door open, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, except for the chair. It was the same chair from the widow's house, impossibly here in her bedroom. It swayed gently back and forth as though someone had just left it. Emma's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment she saw the widow sitting there, her black crossed face twisted in a mocking grin. Emma stumbled back, her gun aimed at the chair, but when the light steadied, it was empty again. "You can't save them all," the widow's voice whispered, echoing in the room. Emma fired, the sound deafening in the confined space. The chair shattered, splinters flying in all directions. But the moment it broke apart, the shadows in the room surged toward her, swirling like a living storm. Emma screamed as the darkness engulfed her, the cold seeping into her bones. She felt herself being dragged, pulled into a void that seemed endless. Voices echoed around her, Clara's, Marco's, others she didn't recognize, all crying out in despair. Then, as suddenly as it began, the darkness released her. She fell to the floor, gasping for air. The room was silent, the chair gone as if it had never been there. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the text read, "See you soon." Emma didn't sleep that night. She spent the hours until dawn packing a bag, filling it with every tool she thought might help. Her gun, flashlights, a crowbar, holy water she had bought in desperation from a local church. By morning, she had a plan. She was going back to the ruins of the widow's house, and this time, she wasn't leaving until she ended it. Emma parked her car a few hundred feet from the widow's house, or what was left of it. The ruins were shrouded in a dense fog, the air unnaturally still. Even in daylight, the place exuded a malevolent energy. She stepped out of the car, gripping the bag slung over her shoulder, and took a deep breath. This time, there was no backup, no hesitation. It was her against the widow. She approached the rubble carefully, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The chair was still there, untouched and haunting, its presence commanding the center of the debris like a throne. Emma felt the weight of unseen eyes on her as she stepped closer. She set her bag down and pulled out a flashlight, her pistol, and a small vial of holy water. The stories about Amara da Silva had been inconsistent, but one thing was clear. The house had been her domain, and her power seemed tied to it. If Emma could sever that connection, maybe she could stop the widow for good. But how? As she scanned the ruins, her flashlight beam caught something glinting in the rubble. She crouched and unearthed a small, rusted lockbox. It was old, its metal corroded, but the intricate carvings on its surface were still visible. Crosses, symbols, and words in a language Emma didn't recognize. "What are you hiding?" she murmured, prying the box open with her crowbar. Inside was a stack of faded photographs and a leather-bound journal. The photographs were of Amara and her family, smiling and happy, a stark contrast to the stories of her madness. Emma flipped through the journal, skimming the fragile pages. Most of the entries were mundane, recounting daily life in the house. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted. Amara wrote of shadows in the corners of her vision, voices calling her name, and waking up to find scratches on the walls. One passage stood out, written in shaky handwriting. "The house has taken them. My husband, my children, they're gone, swallowed by the darkness. It whispers to me, promising to return them if I stay, but I won't let it win. I've sealed the heart of the house. If anyone finds this, burn the chair. It holds the darkness. It is the key." Emma's heart raced as she read the words. The chair. It wasn't just a relic, it was the source of the widow's power. If Amara had sealed the darkness within it, destroying it might end the curse for good. She grabbed the journal and stood, her resolve hardening. She pulled a can of gasoline from her bag, unscrewed the cap, and doused the chair until it was soaked. The acrid smell filled the air as she struck a match and tossed it onto the wood. The flames roared to life, consuming the chair in seconds. Emma stepped back, shielding her face from the heat. But as the fire grew, the ground beneath her began to tremble. A low, guttural roar echoed from the rubble, and the shadows that had been lying dormant surged toward her. The widow emerged from the smoke, her form twisted and monstrous, her black crossed face contorted with rage. "You think you can end me?" she bellowed, her voice shaking the air. "You are nothing." Emma fired her pistol. the bullets passing through the widow's form without effect. The shadows lashed out, striking her shoulder and sending her sprawling to the ground. Her flashlight skittered away, plunging her into near darkness. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," the widow hissed, towering over Emma. But Emma wasn't done yet. She reached for the vial of holy water, clutching it tightly as she rose to her knees. "You're not just a spirit, are you?" she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're part of this house, and if the house dies, so do you." The widow's form flickered, her confidence faltering. Emma hurled the holy water at her, the liquid sizzling as it struck. The widow screamed, her body fracturing like shattered glass. The shadows recoiled, writhing in agony as the fire consumed the chair completely. The ground beneath Emma cracked open, revealing a swirling void of darkness. The widow's form began to collapse, pulled toward the void like smoke caught in a vortex. "No," she howled, her voice filled with desperation. "You can't." Her words were cut off as the void swallowed her whole. The shadows dissipated, the air growing still once more. The fire died down, leaving only ashes where the chair had been. Emma collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The weight that had pressed on her chest since entering the house was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. She looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through the fog for the first time in what felt like days. It was over. Weeks later, Emma sat in her office, staring at the journal she had retrieved from the lockbox. The case was officially closed, with Clara and Marco safe and the house declared a structural failure. No one believed her story, of course, but that didn't matter. She knew the truth. She flipped to the final page of the journal, her eyes lingering on Amara's last words. "The darkness is patient. If you let it in, it will take everything." Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Martinez. "Reyes," she answered. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "A construction crew just found something while clearing the widow's property." "What is it?" she asked, dread creeping into her voice. "It's the chair," he said, perfectly intact. Emma's blood ran cold as Martinez continued, oblivious to the weight of his words. "What do you want me to do with it?" Emma didn't answer. She stared at the journal, her grip tightening. The widow might be gone, but the darkness wasn't done. Not yet. The end.